The room was silent except for the faint hum of the neon sign outside her bakery. Sweet Victory, flickering in the night. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon and sugar, a comforting aroma that had become a staple in the small, tight-knit community. But tonight, the warmth of the bakery was overshadowed by a chilling tension. Margaret Maggie Thompson, a stout, broad-shouldered woman with a laugh that could shake the walls, stood behind the counter, her dark eyes sharp and alert. At 52, Maggie had seen her fair share of battles, both on and off the field. A retired Army Ranger, she had traded her combat boots for an apron, but the fire in her heart hadn't dimmed. She had built Sweet Victory from the ground up, a place where everyone, regardless of who they were, could find a slice of happiness. But not everyone in town saw it that way. Earlier that day, a group of men had come in, their faces masked with fake smiles and their words dripping with thinly veiled disdain. They had made snide remarks about her weight, her skin color, and her kind taking over the neighborhood. Maggie had handled it with the calm precision of someone who had faced far worse. She had served her country for over 2 decades, and a few bigots weren't going to rattle her. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the streets grew quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The men had lingered too long, their eyes scanning the bakery like they were casing the place. She had locked up early, double-checked the security system, and even called her old friend and fellow veteran, Marcus, just to be safe. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened next. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the stillness like a gunshot. Maggie's head snapped toward the front of the bakery, her body instinctively shifting into combat mode. Shadows moved in the darkness, their figures distorted by the broken shards of her storefront window. She counted at least 5 of them, their faces covered with black masks, their hands clutching crowbars and spray paint cans. They moved with a cocky swagger, like they owned the night, unaware of who they were dealing with. Maggie's heart pounded, but her mind was eerily calm. She had been trained for moments like this, moments where the line between predator and prey blurred, and only the quickest, smartest, and strongest survived. As they began to ransack the bakery, overturning tables and smashing her prized pastries, Maggie slipped into the back room. Her hands moved with practiced precision, unlocking a hidden cabinet she had installed when she first opened the shop. Inside was a reminder of her past life, a tactical vest, a pair of brass knuckles, and a few other tools of the trade. She didn't need a gun. Her hands had always been her most reliable weapons. Slipping on the vest, she took a deep breath, her mind racing through the possibilities. These men thought they were untouchable, that they could intimidate her into silence, but they had no idea who they were messing with. Maggie wasn't just a business owner. She was a warrior, a protector, and tonight, they were about to learn that the hard way. The leader of the gang, a tall, wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, stepped into the back room, his crowbar glinting in the dim light. "Thought you could hide, huh?" he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. Maggie stood in the shadows, her fists clenched, her breathing steady. She could hear the others laughing in the main room, their voices echoing like a pack of hyenas. But her focus was on the man in front of her, the one who had dared to step into her domain. He took a step closer, his confidence unshaken, unaware that he was walking into a trap. Maggie's lips curled into a faint smile as she stepped into the light, her eyes locking onto his. "You picked the wrong place to mess with," she said, her voice low and steady. The man froze, his bravado faltering for the first time. But before he could react, Maggie moved, her body a blur of motion. As she closed the distance between them, the sound of a scuffle echoed through the bakery, followed by a loud crash. The gang members in the main room stopped their destruction, their heads snapping toward the back room. "Boss?" One of them called out, his voice tinged with uncertainty. There was no response, only the sound of heavy breathing and the faint creak of floorboards. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado beginning to crack. They had come here to intimidate, to destroy, But now they were the ones feeling the weight of fear. One of them, a younger guy with shaky hands, took a step toward the back room, his crowbar raised. "We should leave," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was too late. The door to the back room swung open, and Maggie stepped out, her face calm but her eyes blazing with a fire that sent chills down their spines. The gang members froze, their weapons slipping from their hands as they took in the scene before them. Their leader was nowhere to be seen, and Maggie stood tall, her presence commanding the room. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message was clear. This was her territory, and they had made a grave mistake. But just as the tension reached its peak, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder with each passing second. The gang members panicked, scrambling to escape through the broken window. But Maggie didn't move. She stood her ground, her eyes fixed on the flashing lights outside. The police were coming, but she knew this wasn't over. These men weren't acting alone, and whoever had sent them would be back. Maggie's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. Who had targeted her? And why? The answers were out there, lurking in the shadows, and she was determined to find them. But for now, all she could do was wait and prepare for the storm that was coming. The sirens grew louder, their wailing cutting through the night like a knife. Maggie stood in the middle of her ruined bakery, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The gang members had fled, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Overturned tables, shattered glass, and the faint smell of spray paint lingering in the air. The neon sign outside flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the chaos. Maggie's hands were still clenched into fists, her knuckles white, but her mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just a random act of vandalism. It was personal, and she needed to figure out why. As the first police car screeched to a halt outside, Maggie took a moment to collect herself. She wiped a streak of flour from her cheek and straightened her apron, the familiar weight of the tactical vest hidden beneath it grounding her. The officers stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim light. One of them, a young cop with a nervous energy, glanced around the room, his eyes widening at the destruction. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Maggie nodded, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "But they weren't here to rob me. They were sending a message." The officers exchanged glances, their radios crackling with static as they called for backup. Maggie knew the drill. She had been through enough investigations to know how this would go. They would ask her questions, take photos, and file a report. But she also knew that the police could only do so much. This wasn't just about catching the men who had broken into her bakery. It was about uncovering the reason behind it. And Maggie had a feeling that the answer was closer than she thought. As the officers began their work, Maggie's mind drifted back to the past few weeks. There had been signs, small, subtle things that she had brushed off at the time. A few weeks ago, she had noticed a car parked outside the bakery late at night, its engine running but no one inside. Then there were the flyers that had started appearing around the neighborhood, their bold letters screaming about taking back the community from outsiders. Maggie had dismissed them as the work of a few disgruntled locals. But now, she wasn't so sure. Someone had been watching her, studying her routines, waiting for the right moment to strike, and she needed to find out who. The sound of a familiar voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Maggie!" Marcus, her old army buddy, rushed into the bakery, his face etched with worry. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a no-nonsense demeanor. But his eyes softened when he saw her. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice low. "Are you hurt?" Maggie shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I'm fine, Marcus, but they messed up my shop." Marcus glanced around, his jaw tightening as he took in the damage. "This wasn't random," he said, echoing her thoughts. "Someone's trying to scare you." Maggie nodded. her mind already working through the possibilities. She had made enemies over the years, both in the military and in her civilian life. But none of them had ever come after her like this. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to intimidate her. They were trying to break her. And Maggie wasn't about to let that happen. "I need to find out who's behind this," she said, her voice firm. Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I'm with you, Maggie. Whatever you need." As the night wore on, the bakery became a hive of activity. Police officers moved in and out, taking statements and collecting evidence. Neighbors gathered outside, their faces filled with concern and curiosity. Maggie watched it all with a sense of detachment. Her mind focused on the bigger picture. She knew that the answers wouldn't come from the police or the neighbors. They would come from her instincts, her training, and her determination to protect what she had built. By the time the sun began to rise, the bakery was quiet again. The police had left, promising to follow up on any leads, and Marcus had gone home to get some rest. Maggie sat alone in the back room, a cup of coffee in her hands and a map of the neighborhood spread out on the table in front of her. She had marked the locations where the flyers had been found, as well as the spots where she had noticed suspicious activity. There was a pattern there. She was sure of it. But she needed more information. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the table. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. Detective Alvarez. She had worked with Alvarez on a few cases in the past, and he was one of the few people she trusted. "Maggie," he said when she answered, his voice tense. "I just heard about what happened. Are you okay?" Maggie sighed, running a hand over her face. "I'm fine, Alvarez, but this wasn't just a break-in. Someone's targeting me." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Maggie could almost hear the gears turning in Alvarez's mind. "I'll look into it," he said finally. "But be careful, Maggie. If someone's coming after you, they're not going to stop." Maggie hung up the phone, her mind racing. Alvarez was right. This wasn't over. Whoever was behind this had made their move, and now it was her turn. To respond, she stood up, her eyes scanning the map one last time before folding it up and tucking it into her pocket. She had a plan, but it was risky. She would need to dig deeper, to confront the shadows that had been lurking at the edges of her life, and she would need to do it alone. As she stepped out of the bakery and into the early morning light, Maggie felt a familiar sense of determination settle over her. She had faced impossible odds before, and she had always come out on top. This time would be no different. But as she walked down the quiet street, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, and she needed to be ready. Because when it hit, there would be no turning back. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street as Maggie walked, her boots crunching against the gravel. She had left the bakery behind, but the weight of what had happened lingered like a storm cloud over her head. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions, each one more pressing than the last. Who had sent those men? Why target her? And what did they want? She knew the answers wouldn't come easily, but she also knew she couldn't sit around waiting for the next attack. She had to take control of the situation, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. Her first stop was the local community center, a small, weathered building that had become a hub for neighborhood meetings and events. Maggie had always been a familiar face there, often donating pastries for fundraisers or volunteering her time. But today, she wasn't there to help. She was there to gather information. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old coffee and stale donuts. A handful of people sat at folding tables, their voices low as they discussed the recent tensions in the neighborhood. Maggie recognized a few faces: Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who ran the knitting club, and Mr. Patel, who owned the corner store. But there was one person she was particularly interested in: Carl, a wiry man in his late 40s, who always seemed to know more than he let on. Carl was sitting in the corner, his eyes darting around the room like he was expecting trouble. Maggie approached him slowly, her hands in her pockets to appear non-threatening. "Carl," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." He looked up at her, his expression wary. "Maggie," he muttered, nodding toward an empty chair. She sat down, leaning in slightly. "You've heard about what happened at my place last night," she said, not bothering to sugarcoat it. Carl nodded again, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Yeah, I heard. Rough stuff." Maggie studied him for a moment, her eyes narrowing. "You know something, don't you?" she asked. Carl hesitated, glancing around the room before leaning in closer. "Look, Maggie, I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's been talk. Some folks aren't too happy about people like you moving in and taking over." Maggie's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "What kind of talk?" she pressed. Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "There's a group, calls themselves the Neighborhood Watch, but they're not exactly watching out for everyone, if you know what I mean." Maggie's mind raced. She had heard whispers about the group before, but she had always dismissed them as a bunch of loudmouths with nothing better to do. Now, she wasn't so sure. "Do you know who's behind it?" she asked. Carl shook his head quickly. "No, and I don't want to know. But if I were you, I'd be careful. These guys don't play around." Maggie left the community center with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The Neighborhood Watch was involved. She just needed to figure out how deep their influence went. As she walked back to her bakery, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Marcus. "Got some info. Meet me at the diner." Maggie's heart quickened. Marcus wasn't one to waste time, and if he had information, it was worth hearing. The diner was a small, greasy spoon tucked away on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where the coffee was always hot, and the conversations were always hushed. Marcus was sitting in a booth near the back, his face grim as he sipped from a chipped mug. Maggie slid into the seat across from him, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of trouble. "What do you have?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. Marcus set his mug down and leaned in, his voice low. "I did some digging," he said. "Turns out, the Neighborhood Watch isn't just a bunch of angry locals. They've got connections, big ones. Someone's funding them, and it's not just pocket change." Maggie's stomach churned. This was bigger than she had thought. "Do we know who?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. But I've got a few leads. One of them points to a guy named Victor Kane. Ever heard of him?" Maggie frowned, the name ringing a faint bell. "Vaguely," she said. "Real estate developer, right?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah, and he's been buying up property all over the neighborhood. Word is, he's been pushing people out, pressuring them to sell. And if they don't, well, let's just say bad things tend to happen." Maggie's mind raced as she connected the dots. If Kane was behind the Neighborhood Watch, then this wasn't just about her. It was about the entire community. And if he was willing to go after her, he wouldn't hesitate to go after anyone else who stood in his way. "We need to stop him," she said, her voice firm. Marcus nodded, but his expression was grim. "It's not going to be easy, Maggie. This guy's got money, power, and a lot of people in his pocket. If we go after him, we're going to need proof. And a plan." As they sat there, the weight of the situation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Maggie knew they were up against something much bigger than a few thugs with crowbars. This was a fight for the soul of the neighborhood, and it was one she couldn't afford to lose. But as she looked around the diner, at the tired faces of the people who called this place home, she felt a spark of hope. They weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for each other. And that was a fight worth having. The sound of a car engine outside pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced out the window, her heart skipping a beat when she saw a black SUV parked across the street. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, but she could feel the weight of someone's gaze on her. Marcus followed her line of sight, his expression darkening. "We've got company," he muttered. Maggie's hand instinctively went to the pocket of her jacket, where she kept a small can of pepper spray. She didn't know who was in that car, but she wasn't about to take any chances. The tension in the diner was palpable as the minutes ticked by. The SUV didn't move, and neither did Maggie or Marcus. It was a standoff, a silent battle of wills. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the engine roared to life, and the SUV pulled away, disappearing down the street. Maggie let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, but the relief was short-lived. Whoever was in that car wasn't done with her, and she wasn't done with them. As she and Marcus left the diner, the sun was high in the sky, but the shadows seemed darker than ever. Maggie knew the road ahead would be dangerous, but she also knew she couldn't back down. This was her home, her community, and she would do whatever it took to protect it. But as she walked down the street, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger, she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The storm was brewing, and when it hit, there would be no escaping it.